Hello. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. Today's a milestone for me. It's my 50th birthday. It's caught my full attention because honestly, when I turned 40, we were so busy running after the boys and doing other things that I was probably 43 before I realized I was in my 40s at all. But today's a bit different. Maybe it's because I went to the doctor this week and he actually told me for a 50-year-old I'm doing pretty well. Or maybe it's because we're at a point in our life where everything has begun to slow down a little bit and I have more time to get reflective and to pay attention to the things that are going on around me. There was a time in my life when 50 seemed so far away. When I was younger, we did everything on the fly. We made plans on the go. We lived at the speed of light. But nowadays, everything is slowing down a bit. And in my times of reflection, I can look at pictures of a much younger Jeremy and Trista hiking in the mountains or going on some sort of trip. And on the one hand, it seems like we did that yesterday. And on the other hand, it seems like that was forever ago. I acknowledge I'm no longer middle-aged, but I don't really feel old. Hopefully, I've grown wiser and much more thoughtful than I was 20, 30 years ago. I do know that psychologists have been tracking the mental changes that take place in a man's life as he grows older for decades. And I know that when a man turns 50 years of age, a lot of things begin to change rapidly in their life. Like men that are 50 struggle with a newly developed discontentment with life. We become bored with things and or people that we previously found interesting. A lot of men in their 50s try to rediscover their youth by participating in risk-oriented thrills. And this is the time in life when we begin to question all of the values which have shaped our life and our past behavior and led us up to this point. And a lot of us find ourselves confused about who we are and where we're headed. Basically, once you get past middle age, men begin to fight and struggle with the reality of growing older. We're faced with our own mortality, and we begin to participate in activities to help us recapture the feelings of being 10 foot tall and bulletproof that we had in our 20s. And oftentimes that leads to trouble. We're presently in a series where we're looking at the story of God, but this morning, because it's my 50th birthday, I want us to go back to a story that we skipped over. I want us to take some time to look at a story about someone else who is around 50 years of age and started chasing his youth. And all he did was he ended up finding pain and chaos. By the time King Saul dies, David's 30 years old. And while a lot of people are anxious for David to be the next king of Israel, not everybody thought that should be the case. I understand that the prophet Samuel had anointed David to be the next king, but Saul had another son. And they end up being a 7.5-year civil war between the supporters of David and those that supported the house of Saul. It's not until David is about 37 years of age that he's finally able to take the throne and to rule over a reunited Israel. At that point, it seemed like everything was going to go great. The man after God's own heart leads Israel to victory after victory against their enemies. He expands the borders of the kingdom, and Israel enters into this wonderful season of great prosperity. But eventually, we get to our text this morning, and David has been king for about 13 years. He's now around 50 years of age. And what we discover is that David seems to be struggling with his own age and his own mortality. And as a result, we discover that he makes a couple of bad decisions that lead to pain and chaos. My friend Jerry Barber used to tell me, you don't sin because you think about sinning. You sin because you don't think about it enough. In other words, if we don't think about all of the ramifications of our decisions, we make mistakes. Our thinking slows down. We don't put forth the effort into thinking about what's going on or what's going to happen. That's exactly what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 11 when we read, In the springtime of the year, the season when most kings took their soldiers out to fight, David stayed in Jerusalem and sent Joab out as general in charge of David's men and the whole army of Israel. They destroyed the Ammonites and put the city of Rabbah under siege. Early one morning, David rose from his bed and was strolling on the palace roof when he saw a woman bathing on the roof below his. She was very beautiful. David sent someone to find out who the woman was, and the answer came back that she was Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was one of David's officers who had gone to war with the rest of David's troops. David sounds like he's struggling with turning 50. He's become bored with the things that he used to find interesting. He stayed home instead of going off to fight. He seems discontent with what's going on. He sends Joab out to lead the army. He's questioning his values. He's confused about his direction because he sees a beautiful woman bathing on the roof, and he asks, "Who is this woman?" Only to be told she's the wife of Uriah, one of his mighty men, one of his bravest soldiers, the daughter of Elam, who was also one of the mighty men and a brave soldier, and she was the granddaughter of Ahithophel, David's chief counselor. Ahithophel ranked above all the other priests. It doesn't seem that David is doing very well growing older. There's no doubt that David's past was littered with one success after another. Rising from his humble beginnings in the field with sheep, he becomes a giant killer, a psalm writer, a respected military commander, and then king over all of Israel. He created a respected military force. He was never defeated on the battlefield. Israel is the center of trade with a strong financial health. You could say that David has reached the top of his game. But here at 50 years of age, his life begins to drift off course, and now he seems bored, listless. And that's a dangerous place to be. There was a time that David was passionate about everything, but he doesn't feel that passion anymore. And there may be nothing as dangerous as a passionate man with nothing to be passionate about. There was a time in his life that David would have talked to God about this. He used to talk to God about everything. And now he's not even doing that. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe he's afraid that God will give him some terrible chore or some horrible errand if he ever dared to tell God that he was bored. But whatever the reason, David keeps all of this to himself. He mopes around the house, napping into the evening hours. And as we just read, one evening he gets up from bed and he sees her. I understand that we all see things that we don't mean to see. It happens. Everybody who's ever been on the internet has found something eventually that they can't unsee, whether they were looking for it or not. So you close the window, you erase your history folder, and you avert your eyes. But David doesn't avert his eyes. Honestly, I really doubt that's the first time that he's ever seen her. She's like his own personal version of Skinamax. He can't sleep, so he turns on the TV. He knows that he shouldn't be on that roof looking that way, but his eyes remain fixed, and once sin enters the room, it's difficult to close the door. Picking up in verse 4, David couldn't get her off his mind, so he sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him. She came, and they had sexual relations. Soon after she returned home, Bathsheba realized she was pregnant, and she sent this news to David. Since their encounter occurred just after the purifying bath, after her period, her husband Uriah could not have been the father. The Bible's brutally honest here. I think some of us would rather make excuses or just try to get past what happened. I mean, it's just one sin, right? Maybe David wants to feel something, anything. But how in the world do you excuse the sin? I mean, we don't know if Bathsheba was a willing participant. After all, David's the king. His orders are followed without question. And even though the story's about to get worse, there's no excuse for what David has already done. Maybe David had thought about this sin as a one-time event, but David didn't think about sin long enough. You see, a few weeks later, he receives this disturbing message: Bathsheba's pregnant. And to make a bad situation worse, her husband is out on the exact same battlefield where David should be. So now David has a choice to make. He can come clean right now. He can apologize to Bathsheba, to her husband, to the nation, his family, apologize to God. He can end everything right here, right now. Or he can make a bad situation worse. He sends for Uriah. There's no need to panic. If he can get Uriah to come home and to sleep with his wife, then maybe people will get a little fuzzy on the math, or they might think that the baby showed up a little early. But Uriah, who's not even Jewish by birth, proves to be a better Israelite than the king. Uriah keeps the law that prohibits him from going home to his wife. David gets desperate, and desperate people do horrible things. He reasons, you know what? If I can get Uriah drunk, then there's really no way that a drunken man could resist the opportunity to sleep with his own wife. But we discover that even drunk, Uriah has more self-control than David does sober. With no other options in his mind, David sends Uriah back to the battlefield with a message for his commanding officer. He believes the only thing that he can do now is to have Uriah killed. Make it look honorable. Have him die on the battlefield. Just make sure he's dead. Then after the deed's done, David takes in a grieving widow, marries her himself, and after an appropriate time of mourning has passed, make sure that all of the appearances look like this is God-driven. How in the world does something like that happen? I mean, it's one thing when somebody who has a pattern of rejecting God, I mean, if this was a story about a godless, womanizing heathen, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, that's how they act. But this is David, a man after God's own heart, the same David that wrote about how much he loved God's law and how he meditated on it day and night. The fact is, David's 50 years old. He's guilty of lust, covetousness, rape, deception, manipulation, adultery, murder. That's 5 of the 10 commandments right there. You can hear the desperation at the end of the chapter when we read, "But the Eternal One was displeased with what David had done." And if David can fail, what do we do when we fail at 40 or flop at 50 or stall at 60? I think we need to keep reading, because in 2 Samuel 12, we discover the Eternal One sent the prophet Nathan to visit David. And I love the way that David is confronted by Nathan. I know if we ever get the guts to confront somebody, we normally kick in the door, put our finger in their chest, and talk out of a sense of superiority. And then we wonder why the person that we're confronting gets defensive or angry. Maybe Nathan and Paul knew the same thing. Remember, Paul wrote, "If one of our faithful has fallen into a trap and is snared by sin, don't stand idle and watch his demise. Gently restore him." Nathan comes to David in gentleness because, well, that's how God comes to us. God has a purpose when he confronts us in our sin. He wants restoration. God doesn't go for the throat. He doesn't need to prove that he's right. I mean, God already knows he's right. Instead, God desires to bring us to a place of restoration. He wants us to be made whole again. Once David comes face to face with his failure, he could have responded in a lot of different ways. He could have gotten angry. He could have kicked Nathan out of the palace. For that matter, he could have even had Nathan killed. But to his credit, David repents. We read in verse 13 that David says, "I have sinned against the Eternal One." I don't want you to misunderstand what he's saying. He's not ignoring the fact that he sinned against Bathsheba or Uriah or Elam or the people of Israel. He's just acknowledging that the one that he hurt the deepest was God. Shortly after his confrontation, David writes the 51st Psalm. And this morning, I want you to see, what do you do when you fail? David shows us the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge that our hearts need cleansing. In Psalm 51, verse 10, we read, Create in me a clean heart, O God. Restore within me a sense of being brand new. This concept of forgiveness, of being made right with God, is pictured in the Bible a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's a new birth, sometimes it's the canceling of a debt, sometimes it's breaking off of a heavy chain. But the picture of forgiveness that David uses here is probably the one that we're most familiar with. He describes it as a cleansing. The truth is, sin is dirty, it's filthy, it stains our lives. Isaiah puts it this way: all of us are dirty with sin. All the right things we have done are like filthy pieces of cloth. Truthfully, our souls look like a mechanic that's been working under a car all day, or a gardener who's been out digging in the dirt. We're covered in filth. And so there's this need for us to be cleansed. So David appeals to God for cleaning. He acknowledges that he's gotten himself into this horrible mess. His choices, his selfishness has done nothing but create pain and chaos. He's been messing with things that he shouldn't have been messing with, and now he needs God, and only God, to cleanse him. David doesn't say, Lord, change the way I behave. He says, change my heart. And it's not that how we behave is unimportant. It's just that we have to start with the heart. We can go through all the right motions without our heart being right. But if our heart is right, then everything else will fall into place. David knows that even if he never commits murder or rape again in his life, there is a possibility that he's going to sin again. And so he begs God to clean his heart. He wants God to wash clean the things that he thinks about, to cleanse his priorities, his desires, every bit of it. David knows that only God can do what must be done in his life. And I think today we need to acknowledge that as well. We don't have the power to cleanse ourselves. We don't even have the power to keep ourselves clean. Only God has that ability. Only God can take a heart of sin and purify it and cleanse it. I think, secondly, David teaches us this morning that we have to rededicate ourselves. Anytime that we decide to make a change, we've got difficult work ahead of us to make sure that we continue the changing process. Being dedicated to God is a continual choice. How many times have you made the decision to be more dedicated to the kingdom? You decide you're going to spend more time in prayer, more time in meditation. You may even think in your mind, like David writes in the 51st Psalm, and say, I will teach your ways to those who do wrong, and sinners will turn back to you. I will sing joyfully of your greatness. I would surrender my dearest possessions or destroy all that I prize to prove my regret. That sounds wonderful. But days turn into weeks and months, and you find yourself that you've slowly slipped back into that dysfunction that you were living in before you decided to get close to God. We all struggle with this desire to do what's easy. That's the reason we sin to begin with. We sin because sin is easier than living the life that resembles Christ. The reason that David's in the palace instead of on the battlefield where he belonged is because it was easier. In our lives, it's not enough to decide to make a change. We have to be determined to live out that change every single day. That's why it's so important for you to do more than just to show up to a worship service every now and then. Being dedicated to God means that you fill your life looking for ways to be involved in the work of the kingdom, to be involved in His story. David's determination to serve God with his life is a direct result of God's forgiveness. David doesn't say that I'm going to do a lot of good things and prove myself so that God will save me. What he says is, God, because you have saved me, I can't help but go out and tell others about the greatness of God. David understood that he wasn't saved by his own works. Salvation has nothing to do with who we were, but rather it has everything to do with who God is and who we become once we're saved. It was that acknowledgement that gives David the determination to serve God with the rest of his life. And it's only when we make the same acknowledgement that we can be determined to also serve God with our lives. We serve God because we understand that we've disappointed Him, but He doesn't stay disappointed with us forever. God offers us grace and forgiveness if we are just willing to repent. Which brings us to the table. We go to the table to have a visible and physical reminder that just because we flopped at 50 doesn't mean that God is unable to redeem us once again. We serve a God of unfailing love. We take the bread and the cup as a memorial to his amazing grace and his unfailing mercy. And so this morning, whatever you've done or wherever you've wandered off to, God is waiting at the table to welcome you home. My hope and my prayer is that this morning you will join him at the table and find the redemption and the forgiveness that your soul so desperately longs for. I hope you have a great week. I hope that you remember how deeply that you're loved by God. And if you want to have a piece of cake today to celebrate my 50th birthday, I think that would be great too. Never forget how deeply you're loved and wanted by a God that is full of respect and compassion and mercy. Have a great time around the table. I look forward to seeing you next week.